Hello everyone, my name is Evgeny and you're back on the ZHENATAN channel. Friends, in today's video I want to tell you how I became a self-taught cooper, how it all started, and what made me begin making barrels. It all began in 2018. It was autumn. My friends and I were sitting in this very gazebo, and I happened to glance at my white Fetiasca grapes. By the way, the harvest that year was quite decent, and then a wild thought crossed my mind. Why not try making wine? Before that, I had absolutely no idea what home winemaking was, how to make wine, or what processes were involved. But, as they say, Google to the rescue. After reading a few articles, I already fancied myself an experienced winemaker and started crushing the grapes. In the end, I ended up with about 20 liters of homemade wine, a bit oxidized, but inspired by the thought that I was already quite an experienced winemaker. I started thinking about getting a wooden barrel. After checking the prices, I was a bit shocked by the variety of barrels and their prices. And then I thought, is it possible to make a barrel myself? It was January 2019. Friends, this idea wouldn't leave me alone, so I set about making my first barrel. As for the tools I used, I had an axe, a handsaw, and also a small plane, which, by the way, I later converted into a cross for a specific purpose. That is, it's just a regular, ordinary plane that I carefully cut to the required radius with a jigsaw, attached a cheek, and with this rather simple tool, you can quite easily work on the crosses of wooden barrels. Friends, it probably took me about 2 weeks, maybe a bit more, to make my first barrel. In the end, I ended up with a barrel that was crooked, with different diameters for the heads, but it held about 8 liters. And by the way, it didn't leak at all. Surprisingly enough, the barrel stood filled for about 2 years. Basically, apart from the fact that a few staves eventually cracked, because I didn't pay attention to the direction of the grain in the staves, which is actually very important. And in the end, several staves did crack. There was also some sapwood present, which later started to rot, and the barrel began to leak. But the main thing is, I made my first barrel with my own hands. This, so to speak, gave me wings. Inspired me, as they say in Ukrainian, and I started making more barrels for home winemaking. The next barrel was a 50-liter one, which I still use to this day. I aged red wine in it. Here are my wines, which by now already have quite an aesthetic appearance. A proper bottle with a label. And as for the taste, let me tell you, well, I follow this principle. If it's not better than everyone else's, then at least it shouldn't be embarrassing. The wines are very tasty. I make only dry and semi-dry wines as a matter of principle. I also dabble a bit in making strong spirits like cha-cha and moonshine, which I age in my own barrels made from different types of wood. By the way, there are quite a few videos on the channel where I taste these drinks. I age these kind of spirits in small barrels like this. I have oak barrels, cherry, ash and mulberry barrels, and each type of wood gives the drink its own unique aroma and flavor. Just recently, I started making these small barrels. I'm thinking of putting a label on here, filling it with my own, let's say, signature brandy, and giving it as gifts to friends for various holidays. The barrel is quite attractive. The barrel holds about 0.6 liters. And I think each of my friends would be happy to receive such a gift. When making wooden barrels, I realized that aside from the tools I mentioned earlier, I basically have nothing else. So the first thing I did was find this huge hand jointer, a hand jointer on which you can more or less work on the side edge of a stave. But Making a barrel by hand is quite a labor-intensive process, and it takes 2, maybe even 3 weeks to make one barrel. That's why I decided to create homemade machines and devices for making wooden barrels. My first such device was a miter saw. By the way, there's a video about it on the channel. It was made from a vacuum cleaner motor and a gearbox from a broken angle grinder. The saw has been working, thank God, for the 4th year now, and has proven itself quite well. The saw, by the way, has longitudinal movement. It uses 2 car shock absorbers, and you can cut workpieces of quite a decent width. My next homemade device was a milling attachment for milling the side edge of staves for wooden barrels. I had a broken angle grinder. The gearbox was broken, but the electric motor was in excellent condition. So I decided to cut a thread on the motor shaft, attach, they say, a collet chuck there, and make a milling machine. Later on I slightly upgraded this milling table. I made a movable tabletop, which allows me to change and adjust the angle of the side edge of the wooden barrel staves, because for large barrels starting from 5 or 6 liters and I use 21 staves, while for small mugs and barrels I use 15 staves. Naturally the angle changes. How is the angle calculated? I've already posted a video about this on the channel, but I'll repeat it. To calculate the angle of the side edge of a stave, you need to take 360 degrees. That is the circumference, and divide it by the number of staves, then divide that by 2. In this way we get the angle, the required angle of the side edge of a wooden barrel stave. After making this router table, the work of course became much faster. And well, I started to get the hang of it. Next, I began making a jig for cutting the cross groove, for working on the crosses, although I made my first barrels with a homemade crossing tool, which by the way is completely homemade. A jig for cutting the groove for the barrel head. It is made based on the principle used by Spanish or Portuguese coopers. To be honest, I borrowed the design. So it's just an ordinary block of wood with a radius cut to fit the required barrel. In fact, for each barrel, for barrels of different volumes, you need a separate crossing tool. That is, the radius will change. Therefore, it's best to have several of these jigs for cutting the groove for the barrel head. Here, there's a piece of ordinary saw, 4 teeth, and a closing tooth. This is a tooth with a carbide tip. I use one from a saw blade. I cut out a small piece and inserted it here. Next, a cheek made from an ordinary board is attached, which runs along the edge of the barrel, and in this way we cut the groove for the barrel head. I have to say, the work is quite hard, and the groove itself turns out rather messy. In other words, using a power tool really speeds up this process and makes the groove high quality and neat. So when using such a hand tool, you need to use some additional materials to seal the bottom. You can use dried cattail, or you can use a special sealant for oak barrels which is widely available online. The sealant is called Enaplastica, from some Italian company, I don't remember the name, and I sometimes use it when restoring wooden barrels. Now I have reached the level where I can restore barrels, I can cut barrels down, turning large ones into smaller ones. By the way, there's a video about this on the channel from, I think, a 70 or 80 liter barrel. I made a neat little barrel of about 45 liters. I filmed the entire process of restoration and cutting in this video and uploaded it to the channel. If you're interested, you can check it out. The link to the video will be in the description. I want to say that in my new barrels and casks, I don't use any sealing materials. The level of fitting there is quite high. What should you aim for to make sure there are no gaps so the barrel won't leak and will reliably serve you for a long time? The next stage in my corporate car career was making a homemade circular saw. To be honest, I had help making the circular saw. That is, I didn't make it myself. I took part in the drawings and the process itself, but it was my friends who helped me build it. I have a woodworking machine and a large woodworking machine that I sometimes use for working with metal. But working with metal, let's say, is still difficult for now because the machine has a lot of play, and I'm working on fixing that. These two lathes are a huge help to me when it comes to woodworking. I use them to work on the crosses of small barrels, to make stoppers, to make all sorts of handles, and much more. As I started to get more practice, that is, as I made more barrels, the quality of my work improved. I began to buy factory-made power tools because people started ordering barrels from me. At first, it was friends who placed orders, but then complete strangers started ordering as well. I immediately bought a two-handled handheld router. By the way, I tend to buy fairly inexpensive routers, let's say Chinese ones. They work just fine. Yes, you could buy something top of the line, but the prices there are completely different. And for the needs, let's say, specifically related to corporate, I believe that these Chinese routers are more than sufficient. So, at the moment I have two handheld routers, one of which I installed in place of a homemade device for working on the bottoms of wooden barrels. That is for chamfering the bottoms of wooden barrels. According to the old Soviet GO standard, the chamfer on the bottom of a wooden barrel should have an angle of 105 degrees. On the one hand, with such an angle, we need a device to cut a chamfer at an angle of 35 degrees or 30, I don't quite rem, I think it's 35, 30 degrees. And on the other side, the opposite side, there should be a device that will cut a chamfer at a 45-degree angle. Only in this case will we achieve the required angle according to the GO standard. But I don't have such a device. And cutting chamfers by changing the cutter every time is quite difficult and, in my opinion, impractical. I have a cutter installed that makes a 60-degree chamfer on both sides of the bottom, and the bottom works perfectly. There have been no complaints, leaks, or any other issues with the bottoms on my barrels. So, at first I made a homemade device, which was built from the motor of an old automat washing machine. A shaft was made along with a bearing housing and a collet clamp. The cutter was inserted there, and in a regular kitchen countertop, which I still use to this day, a hole was cut out and this milling, so to speak, machine was installed. This machine did not provide, let's say, the required number of revolutions. The motor runs at about 12,500 revolutions per minute. Even taking into account adjustments with pulleys, the maximum I could get at the output was, well, 6,000 revolutions per minute. No more than 6,000 revolutions per minute. For working with wooden blanks, that's quite low. Therefore, after using this machine for some time, I came to the conclusion that I needed to install a spindle there. I installed and mounted a 200 router there. By the way, there's a video about this upgrade on the channel. If you're interested, you can check it out. The link to the video will be in the description. So, after installing the factory unit, that is a factory router, the work went much faster and with better quality. And now the adjustment process and the number of revolutions are completely sufficient. That is, with more revolutions, naturally, the process of removing wood goes much faster and with better quality. Also, by changing the spacers in this machine, you can install different cutters and also chamfer various workpieces. For example, stands for wooden barrels. So you can use a handheld router, or you can swap out the collet and the bit and use this router table. I also use a one-handed router in my work, the fuel-end router. This is by no means an advertisement. It has a lot of drawbacks, and the lift mechanism constantly gets stuck. But at the same time, I have no complaints about the electrical part. It works reliably, and in general, I can recommend using it for making wooden barrels. And my latest purchase is a metal bend saw. Of course, this saw is quite suitable for such tasks, for small barrels, but for larger ones, you need a bigger and more powerful saw. When preparing staves for wooden barrels, when sawing logs, I use an electric saw. By the way, it's also one of the inexpensive ones. And there is a video on the channel about how to prepare staves and how to saw a log. So maybe I have a kind of know-how, maybe it's my own method, or maybe someone will say that's how everyone does it. Well, I don't know. I've seen people split a log into 4 parts. I also used this method at first, and I still use it now when I have a log, an oak log, that is straight grain. That is, it has no knots, no waviness, nothing like that. You can safely split the log into 4 parts, remove the sapwood and bark, and then these quarters can be sawn on a circular saw. Such species of wood as maple pear. Right now I'm making a barrel out of apple wood. By the way, the video will be on the channel soon. In that case, you don't have to strictly follow the principle of having the grain direction perpendicular to the wide face of the blank. By the way, I want to return to another very important issue in making wooden barrels, the orientation of the growth rings in the stave. A high quality oak barrel is only possible if the staves are made with the correct radial cut. A radial cut is when the growth rings run perpendicular to the wide face of the stave. Then our barrel will be high quality, will hold its shape well, and there won't be any leaks. Once, by the way, I had an incident when making a barrel out of mulberry wood. I made the barrel turned out beautiful, high quality, everything was fine. The client came, picked it up, and 2 days later calls me. The barrel is leaking, it just keeps leaking. Question: where is it leaking? On the bottom, between the rivets. It leaks in the middle of the riveting. So, not along the seams, but exactly in the middle of the stave. Alright, he brings the barrel back to me, and I take it apart, and what do you think I found? There was a crack running inside the stave. In other words, the stave itself hadn't split, the crack was already there in the living wood. How did it appear? Maybe during charring the barrel was well charred and I didn't notice it during processing, or perhaps it showed up later. But the fact remains, the crack is there. I replaced that particular stave. Thank God I have a stock of bent staves, especially mulberry ones. I'll explain why later. I replaced the stave, the client picked up the barrel and was satisfied. To this day, the barrel works perfectly and there have been no complaints. So back to the question of having bent repair staves on hand. Friends, be very careful when waxing barrels, especially barrels made of mulberry and also those made of oak, because when waxing a barrel, there is a very high chance that your hoops might come off, and putting them back on that would be something out of science fiction. First of all, the wax soaks deeply into the wood spores, and you can't get it out with an angle grinder, sandpaper, or anything else. My last fatal mistake was I was restoring a barrel, everything was done, the barrel was assembled, and then the client asked me to wax it. I waxed it. What do you think? The next morning, 2 of the hoops on the ends had come off. I tried everything. In the end, I had to use a hand planize, a hand plane. I repeat, to shave off probably 2 or 3 millimeters from the ends of the barrel, about 7 or 8, maybe 10 centimeters in, just to remove the wax-soaked layer, and only after that was I able to put on new hoops. I had to make new hoops because the old ones were already riveted and no longer fit tightly on the barrel, so I had to make new hoops. So I strongly urge you to be extremely careful when waxing a barrel. Now, regarding the availability of spare staves for a 6-liter Solovica barrel, similarly, I made a new barrel and guard. I was making it for myself and I waxed it. I put it here on the table and filled it with water. I came back 2 hours later, the end hoops had come off. In the end, the barrel had to be scrapped. It's a shame, of course, but now I have a set of repair staves, so don't repeat my mistakes. There were a lot of mistakes, especially at the beginning. When assembling the barrel, a hoop can come off, a hoop can tear or crack, or the cable on the tensioning device can snap. I've experienced all of that. I especially don't recommend making barrels during the cold season. Everyone asks, make a barrel in winter. It's not a problem to make one. That's not the issue. But the wood we use is moist, meaning it's not dry, and I don't have a dry workshop. My garage is cold, and so is the extension where the circular saw is. So yes, the barrel staves seem dry, but they still absorb moisture from the surrounding air. That's why if you make a barrel in winter, just leave it until spring. In spring, all the hoops will fall off because it immediately starts to dry out. The same thing happens when tightening the barrel in cold weather, especially when it's around 0 degrees, when we need to dip the barrel for steaming. The water starts to freeze, the hoops come off, and they do so at the most inconvenient moment. More than once I almost had my fingers smashed. So I recommend making cooperage products only from spring to autumn. In winter, work on making tools, do something at home, or just take care of household chores. And leave the barrels for the warm season. That's my advice. Well, what else can I say? I want to say that making barrels is my hobby, not a way to make a living. I have a good job and earn a decent living. I enjoy doing things around the house and I love making wine. I love to travel. I have 2 excellent cars that I really love. I'm loyal to one brand, though I won't say which. I think you've all seen it. So making barrels is just my hobby. It's a hobby I really love. My wife already grumbles, saying that soon I'll trade everything for my hobby. But as they say, everyone goes crazy in their own way. And finally, I want to address those who want to make their first wooden barrel. If you're interested in the process of making cooperage items, feel free to visit the channel. There are many instructional videos there where I explain in detail and share my experience on how to make a barrel from start to finish, how to make each part of a wooden barrel, be it the bottom or the hoop, and how to tighten the barrel. Check out the channel, watch, learn, subscribe if you haven't already, share the videos with your friends, and make your first barrels. Well, I guess that's all for now. I'll wrap up my already lengthy monologue. So, friends, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.